It was just another evening at the fancy bistro, a popular spot where people came to enjoy delicious food and a classy atmosphere. The restaurant was buzzing with customers dressed in their finest, some there for a romantic dinner, others for business meetings. Among the waitstaff was a young waitress known for her quick, sharp attitude. She was efficient but had a bit of an edge, treating customers politely when they showed her respect, but showing little patience for those she deemed unworthy of her time. Tonight, as she made her way through the tables, balancing plates and charming the regulars with her familiar banter, her eyes landed on a man seated at a back table. He was dressed in a simple, unremarkable suit and had an air of quiet confidence. He didn't look like the typical wealthy guest who usually frequented the bistro. In her mind, he was likely just another person trying to look important without much to back it up. She didn't give him a second thought, going about her work, waiting for him to call her over if he needed anything. The man eventually looked up and caught her eye, signaling her to come over. She approached with a slight frown, already feeling slightly annoyed by his calm, steady gaze. As he requested a glass of water with lemon to start, she hesitated for a moment, giving him a once-over as if judging whether he was worth her time. With a barely concealed sigh, she nodded, letting him know she'd bring his drink shortly. However, as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. Maybe it was the way he looked so at ease, as if he owned the place. Something about it just rubbed her the wrong way. Minutes passed, and she found herself busy with other tables, purposely putting off his request. She decided to take her time, thinking he'd get the hint that he wasn't her priority. As she served other guests, she couldn't help but notice that he was still sitting there, calmly waiting without showing the slightest impatience. This only added to her irritation. She thought to herself that he could be one of those people who acted like they were important, expecting others to cater to them without having a reason to. For some reason, his calmness got under her skin, and she felt a growing urge to show him he wasn't as special as he seemed to think. Finally, after making him wait longer than usual, she approached his table with the menu. Instead of handing it to him respectfully, she tossed it onto the table with a casual motion, her irritation barely hidden. To her surprise, he didn't react. He simply smiled politely, nodded his thanks, and started looking through the menu. She had expected some kind of reaction, maybe a little annoyance or embarrassment, but he stayed calm and composed, as if her behavior didn't bother him in the slightest. The other guests around them started to notice the tension, exchanging glances and murmuring quietly. The waitress could feel their eyes on her, but instead of feeling embarrassed, she only became more annoyed. In her mind, this stranger was still just some guy pretending to fit in where he didn't belong. Little did she know, the man was much more than he appeared, and her dismissive attitude was about to lead to consequences she could never have imagined. The man finally looked up from the menu and caught the waitress's eye, giving her a polite nod. She walked over, bracing herself for what she assumed would be some complicated or annoying order. To her surprise, he asked only for a simple drink. The tone of his voice was calm, almost soothing, and he smiled politely as he made the request. But somehow, his calmness made her feel irritated. She didn't know why, but something about his gentle, polite way bothered her. She was used to a certain type of guest in this restaurant, people who wanted to show off their wealth, who came dressed in designer clothes and demanded the best service. But this man was different. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that screamed money, yet he seemed completely at ease in this high-end place. She took a moment to consider his request, then, almost as if to put him in his place, she let out a small scoff and walked away, letting him wait once again. She didn't even bother to turn back and see his reaction. To her, he was just another customer who didn't deserve her attention. As she moved between tables, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration each time she noticed him sitting there so quietly, just waiting without a hint of impatience. She began to convince herself that he was probably a guest who thought he could pretend to be someone important. In her mind, she'd seen it before. People coming in, trying to act important, hoping the staff would treat them like VIPs. But this time, she decided she wasn't going to play along. After a long while, she returned to his table, barely glancing at him as she set down his drink with a clink and waited for his order. He thanked her kindly, then calmly asked if he could have a moment to make his choice. Annoyed, she let out a sigh, her frustration starting to show. She felt as though he was deliberately taking his time, as if testing her patience. To her, he was wasting both her time and his own, but she couldn't understand why he didn't seem to care. His calm, collected manner continued to get under her skin, even though he hadn't done anything rude. As he glanced at the menu, she started to mumble under her breath, saying something about people who pretend to be rich, but don't even know how to order in a place like this. She didn't think he could hear her, but he looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with a quiet intensity. He didn't say anything in response, just looked at her, almost as if he could see straight through her. She felt an unexpected surge of discomfort, but she quickly brushed it off, standing firm in her judgment. At this point, a few of the other guests started to take notice, glancing over curiously. The man simply continued looking at her, calm and unbothered, as if he had all the time in the world. She shifted her stance, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was building inside her, but his steady gaze made it impossible. For the first time, a tiny sliver of doubt crept into her mind. Who exactly was this man, and why wasn't he reacting to her attitude the way she expected? As she moved away, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was missing something important. Yet, her stubborn pride wouldn't let her admit it, not even to herself. The man took his time looking through the menu, carefully reading each item while the waitress stood nearby, watching him with a growing sense of annoyance. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong, but his calm, patient manner only made her feel more irritated. She was used to customers who either hurried to place their order or made some big show of their wealth and taste. But this man wasn't rushing or showing off. He seemed perfectly at ease, as though he was in no hurry at all. This attitude felt strange to her, almost as if he was silently challenging her assumptions. Finally, he looked up and started to place his order. But before he could finish speaking, she cut him off, asking, "Do you even know what that dish is?" Her tone was sharp, almost mocking, as if she doubted he could afford or understand the food he was ordering. She crossed her arms, giving him a look that said she didn't take him seriously. The man paused, looking slightly surprised but still calm. He responded politely, saying he was familiar with the dish and that he'd had it many times before. His gentle tone, without a hint of offense, caught her off guard. She didn't know why he didn't react to her rudeness, but his lack of irritation made her even more upset. Nearby, a few other customers noticed the tension and started to glance over, wondering what was happening. But the man remained composed, as if he was completely unaware of the scene she was causing. The waitress felt her frustration rising, as if he was somehow winning an invisible argument with her. She wanted him to be embarrassed, to react, but he just continued to smile calmly, waiting for her to finish writing down his order. His calm was unshakable, and it bothered her more than any angry words or reactions could have. When she finished taking his order, she couldn't resist making another comment under her breath, saying something about people like him trying to act like they belonged in a place they couldn't afford. She barely whispered it, but somehow the words seemed to hang in the air between them. He heard her clearly, but he didn't react. He just watched her, his eyes thoughtful and steady, like he was observing her instead of judging. His calmness was unsettling. It felt as if he saw right through her, as though he knew exactly why she was acting this way. Feeling a little embarrassed, but not wanting to show it, she turned and walked away from the table. Her heart was pounding, and she didn't know why. She kept telling herself he was just a regular customer, nothing special, yet there was something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable, something she couldn't understand. She noticed a few of the other guests exchanging glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. Her pride wouldn't let her back down, though. She was determined to keep showing him that he didn't belong here, even if it meant ignoring the strange, uneasy feeling that was starting to grow inside her. As she walked away, she caught herself glancing back at him, half expecting to see anger or irritation on his face. But he simply returned to reading his menu, as if nothing had happened. This calm, collected man was a mystery to her, and it only made her more determined to keep her guard up. Little did she know that her actions were leading to a moment she would never forget, a moment that would change everything she thought she knew about people and respect. After a while, the man signaled to the waitress, and she walked over, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She couldn't help feeling irritated as he began to speak in his usual calm, polite tone, asking for a few recommendations on the menu. Her patience was already running thin, and she felt he was just testing her. Without much thought, she blurted out, "People like you usually don't order from this part of the menu. Maybe try something simpler." Her words came out harsher than she'd intended, and a few nearby guests looked up, surprised at her tone. The man's face remained calm, though. He seemed unfazed by her words, simply asking, "And what part of the menu is that exactly?" His voice was steady, almost amused, and his reaction threw her off guard. She didn't expect him to question her in such a composed way. She thought he'd get defensive, maybe embarrassed, but he didn't show a hint of either. Instead, he looked at her with a quiet confidence, as if he was completely comfortable in his skin and didn't care what she thought. Feeling slightly caught off guard, she looked down at her notepad and tried to brush off his question. "Well, you know," she mumbled, "the specials here are usually ordered by people who, let's say, know a little more about fine dining." She smirked, hoping he'd feel the sting of her comment, but he just nodded thoughtfully. "I see," he said with a small smile. "I'll take that special then." He handed her the menu with a quiet politeness that only deepened her annoyance. She turned away sharply, her frustration growing with every step back to the kitchen. She felt her cheeks flush with irritation, replaying the conversation in her mind. She'd wanted to put him in his place, but somehow he'd managed to turn her words around, making her feel unsettled without even trying. She couldn't understand why he didn't seem bothered by her attitude. To her, it felt as if he was looking right past her behavior, almost as if he saw something in her that she didn't see in herself. She felt exposed, vulnerable even, and she didn't like it. While she waited for his order to be prepared, she noticed the other guests still watching her interactions with him. Some of them whispered quietly to each other, while others just looked on, curious. She could feel their eyes on her, and for the first time that evening, she started to feel self-conscious. She realized that her attempts to humiliate him had drawn more attention than she intended, and it made her feel strangely uneasy. When his order was finally ready, she carried it back to his table, her hands slightly unsteady. She set the plate down with a small clatter, hoping he wouldn't notice. But as always, he just smiled, thanking her warmly as if she'd been perfectly polite to him all evening. His reaction left her at a loss for words. She'd expected him to react, maybe even call her out, but he didn't. Instead, he kept treating her with respect, which made her own behavior feel colder and ruder by the minute. As she walked away, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and a tiny bit of shame that she couldn't quite shake. Something about this man was different, and it bothered her in a way she couldn't fully explain. She tried to show him he didn't belong, yet he remained calm and respectful, almost as if he was teaching her a lesson without saying a word. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet strength he displayed was about to make a much bigger impact than she could imagine. The night was far from over, and the real surprise was yet to come. As the waitress moved through the restaurant, she tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in. She kept herself busy, attending to other tables, refilling drinks, and making casual conversation with the regulars. But every so often, she'd glance over at the man's table, almost expecting him to be staring back or showing some sign of frustration. But he remained calm, occasionally looking around the restaurant, studying the decor or observing the other guests with a soft smile on his face, like he genuinely enjoyed the atmosphere. There was something about his calm presence that seemed to draw people's attention. A couple at a nearby table even struck up a conversation with him, laughing at something he said. From a distance, the waitress could see their friendly smiles and hear their laughter. She felt a strange twist in her stomach as she watched. She couldn't understand why everyone seemed so comfortable around him, while she found his calmness irritating. The other guests didn't know him, yet they seemed drawn to his warmth and easygoing nature. It was as if he had some quiet charm that made people feel at ease. Finally, the waitress walked over to his table, ready to see if he needed anything else. She approached him with her usual brisk attitude, asking, "So, how's everything?" in a tone that was polite but distant. She hoped he'd say something ordinary or simple, something that would allow her to finish the interaction quickly. But instead, he looked up at her with that same calm smile and said, "It's all been wonderful. Thank you. You've been very attentive." His words caught her off guard. She wasn't expecting such a kind remark, especially after her cold attitude. The warmth in his tone made her feel a bit unsettled, and she wasn't sure how to respond. She managed a small nod and mumbled, "Glad to hear," before walking away quickly. As she returned to the other side of the room, she noticed a few of her colleagues giving her curious looks. One of them even whispered, "What's up with that guy? He's been nothing but nice, but you look like he's causing you trouble." She shrugged, trying to brush it off, but inside, she knew there was something more to her frustration. It wasn't just his calmness or politeness. It was the way he seemed completely unaffected by her attitude. He didn't get annoyed, didn't argue, and didn't seem fazed by her behavior at all. He simply treated her with respect and kindness, as if he didn't see any reason to do otherwise. Later that evening, as the man finished his meal, he signaled her over one last time. She approached cautiously, half expecting some kind of complaint, or, at the very least, a comment about her attitude. But when she arrived at his table, he simply handed her the bill, along with a tip tucked neatly inside. She glanced down at the bill, and her eyes widened slightly. The amount he left was far more generous than she'd expected, far more than she felt she deserved after the way she treated him. She looked up, wanting to say something, maybe even apologize, but the words got caught in her throat. He stood up, smiled at her, and said, "Thank you again for your service. It was a pleasure dining here." His voice was sincere, without a trace of sarcasm or irony, as though he genuinely meant it. Then, with a gentle nod, he walked out of the restaurant, leaving her standing there, holding the generous tip he'd left behind. She watched him go, feeling a mixture of confusion and guilt. Her colleagues, noticing the amount he'd tipped, raised their eyebrows in surprise, murmuring among themselves. She could feel their curious eyes on her, as if they were trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time that night, the waitress felt a pang of regret. She realized she had judged him unfairly, assuming he didn't belong, assuming he was beneath the usual customers she served. But he had proven her wrong, not with anger or harsh words, but with kindness and patience. As she stood there, holding the tip he'd left behind, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a mistake, if perhaps she had let her assumptions cloud her judgment. She was left standing in the middle of the restaurant, feeling as though she'd just missed something important, something that had quietly slipped through her fingers. After the man left, the restaurant felt different to the waitress. She tried to continue with her usual tasks, cleaning tables and taking orders, but her mind kept drifting back to him. His calm manner, his kindness despite her attitude, and especially the generous tip he'd left. All of it stayed with her in a way she didn't expect. She kept replaying their interactions in her head, feeling embarrassed by the way she treated him. She'd assumed he didn't belong, that he wasn't worth her respect. Yet, He had shown her more patience and respect than she had shown him. Her colleagues were curious too. One of them came over, whispering, "Why did he leave such a big tip? He didn't seem like he'd be the type to do that." She just shrugged, feeling unable to explain. The truth was, she didn't understand it herself. She didn't know why he had tipped her so well or why he hadn't reacted to her rude behavior. It was as if he hadn't even noticed her attitude, or maybe he had but chose to overlook it. Whatever the reason, his kindness had left her feeling uncomfortable with herself. As the evening wore on, she tried to distract herself by focusing on her work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She began to question her assumptions about people in general, wondering how many others she had judged without really knowing them. She had always thought she was good at reading people, good at figuring out who belonged and who didn't. But this man had shaken her confidence in her own judgment. He had acted so differently from anyone she'd met before, so calm, so unaffected by her behavior, that it made her wonder if maybe she'd been looking at people the wrong way. Later that night, as she was getting ready to leave, she caught herself glancing around the restaurant, almost expecting him to still be there. She felt silly for thinking about it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed an important lesson, one that he had somehow tried to teach her without words. She remembered the look in his eyes, the quiet confidence and kindness that seemed so genuine. It was like he could see right through her defenses, right through her assumptions, and that thought unsettled her deeply. As she closed up for the night, her mind drifted to thoughts of her own life and the reasons why she'd become so guarded and quick to judge. She remembered the many times she'd been treated unfairly or looked down upon, and she realized that she had started doing the same to others. She had allowed her own experiences to shape her view of people, assuming the worst instead of giving them a chance. It wasn't an easy realization to come to, and it left her feeling both humbled and unsettled. On her way home, she couldn't stop thinking about the man's calm smile and the way he had treated her with respect, even when she didn't deserve it. She wondered what kind of person could be so unaffected by others' judgments, so secure in themselves that they didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She thought about the generous tip he'd left, not as a reward for good service, but perhaps as a reminder that kindness doesn't always come with expectations. The thought left her feeling both grateful and ashamed, as if he had seen a part of her she hadn't been willing to face. When she finally arrived home, she sat quietly, reflecting on the day. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her own judgments, the quick conclusions she'd drawn about people without really knowing them. And in that quiet moment, she found herself hoping that she'd get another chance, another opportunity to treat people differently, to let go of her assumptions, and to meet them with the same respect and kindness the man had shown her. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she knew that his presence had left a lasting impact on her, one that she would carry with her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The next day, as the waitress returned to work, she couldn't shake the memory of the man and how he treated her with unexpected kindness. She felt a new sense of awareness as she moved through her shifts, taking orders, serving drinks, and greeting customers. For the first time, she looked at her guests with a fresh perspective, trying not to let her own judgments cloud her interactions. She wanted to make up for the way she'd acted, to approach people without the assumptions that had led her to treat the man so unfairly. Throughout the day, she found herself being more patient, taking the time to listen carefully to her customers, even those who seemed demanding or difficult. Normally, she would have let her frustration show, or worse, allowed her own biases to affect her tone. But this time, she made a conscious effort to treat each person with genuine respect, regardless of how they looked or behaved. She remembered the man's calm demeanor and how he'd handled her rude behavior with such grace. Somehow, thinking of him reminded her to stay calm and open, to give everyone the same courtesy he had given her. Her coworkers noticed a change in her, too. One of them even commented, "You seem a lot more relaxed today. Usually, you'd be pretty frustrated by now." She just smiled and shrugged, not wanting to admit how much one stranger's actions had affected her. But inside, she felt a subtle shift, a feeling of wanting to be better, to let go of the attitude she'd carried for so long. She realized that holding onto negativity and assuming the worst in others had only made her more guarded and unhappy. The man's actions had shown her a different path, one that felt surprisingly lighter and more freeing. By the afternoon, the waitress began to feel a renewed sense of purpose in her work. She was no longer just moving through her tasks out of habit or frustration. Instead, she found a certain satisfaction in serving people with genuine kindness and respect. When a customer asked for recommendations, she engaged in the conversation fully, sharing what she thought was best on the menu. She noticed how her change in attitude seemed to affect the atmosphere around her too. Customers responded more warmly, smiling at her, thanking her for her service, and even engaging in small conversations. She realized that by giving respect, she was receiving it back in ways she hadn't expected. At one point, an older woman came in alone, looking a bit nervous and out of place. Normally, the waitress might have assumed that the woman didn't fit in or wouldn't be a big tipper. But today, she approached her with a kind smile and guided her to a comfortable seat. She chatted with the woman, recommending dishes and checking in with her throughout the meal. By the time the woman left, she had thanked the waitress profusely, leaving her a modest but heartfelt tip, and even saying, "Thank you for making my day a little brighter." The waitress was touched, realizing that her simple act of kindness had made a difference. As the day went on, she felt more at peace, as though a weight had been lifted. She thought back to the previous day and how she had initially viewed the man as someone who didn't belong. Now she wondered if maybe he had come into her life at the perfect time, challenging her to reflect on her own behavior. She had been so quick to judge, yet he had quietly reminded her, without a single harsh word, of the power of kindness and respect. By the end of her shift, the waitress felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. She understood now that treating people with dignity wasn't just about doing her job. It was about seeing others as human beings, with their own stories and struggles. She'd been given an unexpected lesson, one she hadn't asked for but truly needed. As she finished cleaning up, she realized that her heart felt lighter, filled with a sense of gratitude for the man who had unknowingly opened her eyes. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she knew his lesson would stay with her, a reminder to approach others with an open heart, leaving her judgments behind. The next few days went by, and the waitress continued to notice how her change in attitude was affecting her work and her interactions with others. She found herself connecting more with her customers, even the ones she might have ignored or dismissed before. Each shift felt a little brighter, a little lighter, as she approached each person with genuine care. The weight of her usual judgments and assumptions seemed to be fading, and with it, so did the stress that had once made her job feel like a burden. One evening, as she was wrapping up a particularly busy shift, the waitress heard a soft, familiar voice from behind her. "Excuse me," the voice said gently. She turned around, and there he was, the same man from a few days earlier, standing by the entrance. He looked as calm and composed as ever, with a slight smile on his face. Her heart skipped a beat, a mix of surprise and nervousness, filling her as memories of their last interaction came rushing back. She managed to keep her composure, though, greeting him politely and leading him to a table. She didn't know if he remembered her attitude from before, but she certainly hadn't forgotten. This time, she wanted to make sure he felt welcomed, respected, and genuinely appreciated. She took a deep breath and reminded herself of how much his quiet kindness had changed her perspective, and she promised herself she would treat him the way he had treated her, with respect and patience. As he looked over the menu, she approached his table with a warm, genuine smile. "Can I help you with any recommendations?" she asked, her tone softer than before. He looked up at her, his eyes thoughtful as he studied her for a moment. There was a hint of recognition in his gaze, as if he remembered her too, but he didn't say anything about it. Instead, he simply smiled back and thanked her, asking for her suggestions with an easygoing, friendly manner. Throughout the evening, she made sure to give him her best service. She brought his dishes promptly, checked on him politely, and even shared a few pleasant conversations with him. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chance to serve him again, to show him the kindness he had shown her. Every time she approached his table, he looked at her with that same calm, appreciative gaze, as if he could see the shift in her demeanor and respected the effort she was making. By the end of the meal, as she brought him the bill, the man paused before reaching for his wallet. He looked at her for a moment, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding that made her feel as though he saw right through her. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice gentle but sincere. "You've been very attentive." She felt a surge of relief and gratitude at his words, as if his acknowledgement meant more to her than anything else that day. Without a word, he left a generous tip again, a gesture that made her heart swell with appreciation. This time, though, it wasn't just about the money. The tip felt like a second chance, a quiet acknowledgement of the effort she had made to grow and become a better person. She watched him leave, a warm feeling of accomplishment filling her as he walked out the door. For once, she didn't feel any judgment or assumptions, only respect and a quiet gratitude for the lesson he brought into her life. As she cleared his table and looked at the tip he'd left, she couldn't help but smile. She felt that the man's actions had opened her heart, teaching her to see beyond the surface and to appreciate each person for who they truly were. The lesson was subtle but powerful, and she knew it would stay with her long after he'd gone. She realized that kindness and respect had the power to change not just her attitude, but the way she experienced the world around her. In that moment, she felt truly grateful for the unexpected chance to make things right, to learn from her mistakes, and to grow in ways she hadn't imagined. She promised herself to carry this lesson forward, to approach every person with an open heart, and to let go of the judgments that had once held her back. The man may have left, but his quiet kindness had left a lasting mark, and she felt ready to embrace a new way of seeing the world, one interaction at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the waitress continued to carry the lessons she had learned from that man. She found herself more at peace with her work and her interactions. It wasn't always easy to keep her new perspective, but it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The small changes she had made in the way she approached her job were paying off, not just in her work, but in her personal life as well. She had stopped rushing through her shifts and started taking the time to truly connect with the people around her. She listened more, judged less, and tried to treat everyone with the same kindness that had been shown to her. Her colleagues noticed the difference too. They often commented on how much calmer and more positive she seemed. One of them even joked, "You've got a whole new vibe going on. Less stressed, more chill." She smiled at their words, but didn't go into detail. She knew that something had shifted inside her, but she wasn't sure how to explain it, even to her friends. It wasn't just about being nicer. It was about understanding that everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, deserved respect. She was beginning to see that kindness wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that could transform the way people interacted with each other. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. The restaurant was quieter than usual, with fewer customers trickling in. She had just finished serving a couple at the corner booth when she noticed a familiar face walking through the door. It was him, the man who had taught her so much in such a short time. He stepped into the restaurant, his calm demeanor just as she remembered. This time, however, he didn't come alone. He was accompanied by a woman, and they both looked around the restaurant, as though deciding where to sit. The waitress felt a mix of emotions rise inside her: surprise, nervousness, and a touch of excitement. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was no longer the person she had been that night. She wasn't the same woman who had judged him unfairly or treated him with impatience. This time, she felt ready to show him that she had learned from her mistakes. She approached the table with a smile, just as she had done with every other guest, but this time it felt different. She wasn't pretending to be friendly. She genuinely wanted to offer them the best experience she could. She introduced herself, made a quick joke to break the ice, and recommended some of the restaurant's best dishes. To her surprise, he remembered her right away. "It's nice to see you again," he said warmly, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. His calmness and kindness were just as strong as before, and she felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. As she served them, she took the time to chat with them a bit more, asking about their day and showing a genuine interest in their conversation. She noticed that his companion was also kind and easy to talk to, and the two of them seemed to share a quiet connection that made the atmosphere at the table feel relaxed and comfortable. There was no rush, no tension, just two people enjoying their meal and the simple pleasure of each other's company. By the time they finished their meal, the waitress felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had treated them both with respect and warmth, just as she had promised herself she would. She felt a quiet pride in the way she had handled the evening, and how much she had grown since the last time she had served him. When the bill came, the man looked at her and said, "Thank you for being so kind tonight. We really enjoyed ourselves." The words filled her with a quiet joy, and she nodded, grateful for the opportunity to show him that she had learned. When they left, they once again left a generous tip, but this time, it wasn't about the money. It was about the sense of connection they had shared. She didn't need to be told that she had done well. The way they had treated her, the warmth in their words, spoke volumes. She knew now that kindness wasn't about expecting something in return. It was about offering something of yourself, something real, and watching how it could transform not just your interactions, but your perspective on life. As the evening came to a close, the waitress reflected on how much she had changed since that first encounter. She thought about how easily she had dismissed the man before, how quickly she had judged him, and how wrong she had been. She realized that life wasn't about judging people based on appearances or assumptions. It was about seeing them for who they truly were and treating them with the respect they deserved. And in doing so, she had found a deeper sense of connection, not just with others, but with herself.